Hello, welcome to News Dakota's fourth webinar of 2017-2018. The Ethics and Politics of the Migration Crisis, American and Jordanian Perspectives. My name is Nelson Graves, and I'm speaking to you from Paris, France. I'm the founder of News Dakota, and I'll be your moderator today. And I'm joined on camera today by students at Friends Seminary School in New York City. And we also have in New York City Emily Krasner of the United Nations Population Fund. And in Jordan, we have students at King's Academy School near Amman, the capital. So we have a very crowded agenda today, and for that purpose, I'll be very brief in my introduction, but suffice it to say that the world's never seen so many migrants, many of them forcibly displaced from their homes. And the world is having trouble coping with what we can accurately call the migration crisis. This crisis has had a huge impact on people, obviously, but also on economies, our societies, our cultures, our security, and our politics. And today, we have students on 2 continents and a UN expert to discuss this matter. Now, just a bit of housekeeping. We like these sessions to be interactive, and we invite our viewers to ask questions and make comments at any time. For that purpose, there's a chat room at the bottom of your screen. Please don't be shy and do use it. Now, with that, I'm going to turn over to Friends Seminary in New York to be our first speakers on this session. And over to you, New York.
Hi, guys. Hi.
Hello.
So, although immigration is often featured in the news, headlines and statistics simply don't capture what it's like to leave everything you know and love for the unknown. But stories do. Using stories and statistics that together will humanize the issue, we will provide an overview of the influx of Central American unaccompanied minors in the U.S.
Around the world, the U.S. is often seen as a place of refuge, freedom, and hope. After all, our country was founded by immigrants. Receiving 3 times more immigrants yearly than any other country in the world, the U.S. remains the primary destination for immigrants. However, demand for those seeking refuge here far exceeds those actually granted it.
We are experiencing the largest influx of Central American migrants and asylum seekers in recent U.S. history. More individuals have sought and received asylum from the Northern Triangle of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras in the last 3 years than in the prior 15 years combined. The number of children seeking asylum rose sharply to nearly 52,000 in 2014, the highest level on record. Hailing from the Northern Triangle, over 130,000 unaccompanied minors have been apprehended by U.S. Border Patrol since 2011.
In hopes of a better future, parents, desperate to save their children from gang violence and civil warfare in home countries, have no other choice but to send them on a solitary journey riddled with danger. And this is understandable given the context. Honduras now has the highest murder rate in the world, followed by El Salvador and Guatemala. In a study by the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, 48% of interviewed unaccompanied minors have been personally affected by violence at the hands of organized crime, gangs, or police officers, and 21% have suffered abuse at home. Meanwhile, the cost of food has increased exponentially, making it harder for families to provide for themselves.
There are often 2 legs to an unaccompanied Central American minor's journey northward. The first is traveling out of their country and into Mexico. The second is traveling across the Mexico-U.S. border. In Enrico's journey, journalist Sonia Nazario tells the story of Enrico, an unaccompanied minor from Guatemala who traveled northward, walking, hitchhiking, and wading across rivers. Enrique dogs Mexican immigration officers known as La Migra, who scour buses and streets in search of Central American illegal immigrants. If arrested, they are subjected to violent and humiliating treatment and deported back to their home countries.
Enrique eventually reached a Mexican city where the next leg of his journey required the exceptionally dangerous task of hopping on top of moving freight trains. Or the Beast, the unforgiving train travels northward. In trying to jump onto moving boxcars, some riders slip or fall off while sleeping, losing limbs or dying. Others are robbed by thieves with machetes or guns, assaulted or kidnapped by gangs that control the toxic train cars, or seized by law enforcement conducting checks of freight trains. Enrique was deported 7 times before finally reaching the U.S. on his 8th attempt.
Barely eating or drinking, Enrique traveled for several days on top of these trains, suffering from dehydration and injuries. Adults often take advantage of children like him, and therefore many of these children reach the US-Mexico border having survived physical abuse or rape. Any vulnerability shown is easily exploited. No example showcases this truth more than when Enrique had to trust a stranger, a coyote as they're called, he had just met to take him across the Rio Grande River and to deliver him safely onto US soil. Many children have given a coyote their family's life savings in exchange for safe passage across the border, only to be caught by US immigration authorities, losing their freedom and their money in the process.
The journey to the US-Mexico border is treacherous, as is traveling across the border itself. While successfully arriving in the US represents a fear for many migrants, the next challenge is actually staying here. Some avoid capture by Border Patrol and find sanctuary with loved ones. Others get captured, and their experience is infinitely more complicated and terrifying.
Under the Obama administration, Mexican unaccompanied minors, when apprehended at the border, were immediately deported, while apprehended Central American unaccompanied minors were placed in temporary shelters while their deportation processes got underway. According to a 2013 estimate, there were 80 such facilities that exclusively housed nearly 25,000 unaccompanied children. A greater percentage of unaccompanied minors were allowed to leave these shelters and temporarily reunite with US-based families as they awaited their deportation hearings, a surprisingly compassionate move by an administration that deported more undocumented immigrants than any previous administration.
If they are to have any hope of being granted permission to stay as an asylee or refugee, unaccompanied minors need legal representation, which only 25% of them have. As if the lack of legal representation wasn't enough of a problem, asylum cases have been significantly backlogged, which means that many unaccompanied minors are in legal limbo, simply waiting for their hearing before a judge for months and months on end, with multiple court visits in between. As it is not, though, and it's not as though legislators are eager to fix this backlog, as many are fearful that extending asylum to fleeing Central Americans could broaden grounds for asylum seeking and open the floodgates for a large wave of immigration from Latin America.
Recognizing these problems, the Obama administration established in 2014 the Central American Minors Refugees Program, which allowed qualified children and parent nationals of the Northern Triangle to apply for refugee status, possible resettlement, or temporary humanitarian parole in the US while still in their home countries. The point of this program was to prevent parents from sending unaccompanied minors on the perilous journey northward. As of August 2017, over 3,000 youth have been brought to the US through the program. Another 2,700 children were awaiting travel arrangements to the US when the Trump administration rather suddenly terminated the program just last month, as part of a wider effort by the federal government to radically reduce migration to the US.
We want to be clear that even if Central American unaccompanied minors are granted asylum in the US, together with their families, they can still navigate more difficult terrain. There's no rest for the weary. 22% of Central American immigrant families live below the poverty line, which is a larger share than other immigrant groups, who average a 16% poverty rate. Immigrants from Honduras and Guatemala tend to have fewer educational opportunities and higher rates of poverty than other Central American migrants. 70% of immigrants from the Northern Triangle have limited proficiency with English. A few percentage of immigrants from this territory are college graduates compared to their counterparts from neighboring countries. 40% are medically uninsured.
Clearly, Central American migrants, particularly children, face dangers and challenges most US citizens cannot imagine. Yet that these neighbors of ours continue to brave the elements, both natural and social, to relocate, knowing that struggle, deportation, and death are possible, and in some sense likely, suggests something about the horrors from which they are fleeing.
Thank you. Right.
Since Barack Obama's presidency, the U.S. government has attempted to discourage the influx of Central Americans across its borders by funding Mexico to carry out a ferocious crackdown on these refugees fleeing violence in Central America. In the fiscal year 2015 alone, the U.S. has given Mexico tens of millions of dollars to stop these migrants from reaching the U.S. border to claim asylum.
Essentially, the United States has outsourced a refugee problem to Mexico that is similar to the refugee crisis now roiling in Europe. That said, it could be argued we are playing a much less responsive or friendly host. The U.S. government is sponsoring the hunting of migrants in Mexico to prevent them from reaching the U.S. It is forcing them to go back to El Salvador, Honduras, to their death.
But what of those who successfully made their way into our country? Across the last 2 decades, the U.S. has failed to find a much-needed solution to its broken immigration policy. Many minors have grown up in our country as undocumented under deferred action status. They are known as dreamers. People have called the U.S. their home since childhood or birth, despite their parents' undocumented status, and dream of obtaining legal U.S. citizenship. For the 800,000 dreamers, our country has been the only home they have ever known.
DACA, created in 2012 by President Barack Obama, granted renewable legal status to dreamers after the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act failed to pass Congress. The DREAM Act would have granted U.S. residency to dreamers if they met certain qualifications. DACA allowed dreamers to register with the federal government in exchange for a temporary reprieve from any deportation action, as well as for a work permit allowing them to work legally in the United States. To be eligible for DACA, immigrants must have arrived in the United States before 2007 and must have been 15 or younger when they arrived. They also had to either be enrolled in high school or have a high school diploma and possess a nearly unblemished criminal record.
During his presidential campaign, Trump said that he would put an end to DACA and deport dreamers. In June, the Attorney General of 10 states, all Republicans, threatened to sue the federal government for not ending the program. On September 5th, the Trump administration announced that it would end DACA in March 2018. These 6 months are all that dreamers would have to apply for DACA program. Afterwards, undocumented immigrants, despite their young age, would be deported. The decision was strongly denounced by Democrats and even by some Republicans.
While there are Trump supporters and Republicans who oppose DACA, the vast majority of U.S. citizens, including Trump supporters, do support DACA. According to a poll from earlier this year, roughly 3/4 of Trump voters are in favor of allowing dreamers to stay in the country, and half of Trump supporters support them being able to obtain U.S. citizenship.
In October, Trump suggested that he'd be willing to keep DACA, but only if Democrats agreed to support proposals to crack down on immigration, including building a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border, which Democrats and immigrant activists strongly oppose. No deal has been reached, and DACA is set to expire in March. Hundreds of thousands of young people who were born and raised in the U.S. will face deportation. For most, it will be deportation to countries they have never known. These dreamers are joined every day by a new wave of border crossers. Unlike the dreamers, these children are coming into our country without parents.
The current influx of undocumented and unaccompanied minors means that our country is now playing host to children without any parental presence. These youth are either in detention centers or living with distant relations in a sort of temporary housing situation. Schooling, medical and mental health care, as well as proper legal representation, are reality. The government simply does not have programs in place to meet these needs, and the minors are falling through the cracks.
Much is at stake when these minors seek asylum in our country. They know that if their asylum is denied and are forced to return to their home country, that they will face the very gang violence and poverty that caused them to flee in the first place. It all comes down to the decision a judge makes in the U.S. Immigration Court. But navigating the court system and deportation proceedings is a daunting task. Completing the court-required forms written only in English is difficult. So much can go wrong during this process. If the paperwork they fill out is not exactly right, if they arrive to plead for the case for why they should be granted asylum and show up in the wrong courtroom or minutes late, then their courtroom hearing can be set back months.
These minors seeking asylum should not be left to navigate these complex court systems all alone, but our government does not provide legal representation for them. Whether it's an economic issue, there simply isn't enough budgetary funding, or one of moral will, or the lack thereof, the government does not see this as their responsibility.
As often happens when government fails to meet societal needs in our country, the philanthropic or nonprofit sector rises up to fill that gap. This summer, some of us were able to visit the New York Immigration Court and see this play out in real time. As these minors presented themselves in court, there were pro bono lawyers standing in the wings to intercept them and try to assist in pleading their cases. One of the nonprofit organizations providing this legal assistance is called Safe Passage Project, which uses both volunteer lawyers and full-time staff members to provide legal representation free of charge to these youths. Their work supports these children's rights during the process. Unfortunately, demand far exceeds the number of cases these lawyers can handle. Funding for programs such as this rely on individual and corporate donors for their support.
And the legal needs of these minors are just the tip of the iceberg. Unimaginable trauma along their journey. It has become clear to immigrant advocates that mental health services with Spanish-speaking therapists are also desperately needed. A nonprofit organization here in New York City, Terra Firma, is working to fill that gap. Terra Firma offers individual counseling and medical appointments for children and their guardians. At the heart of its program is a 10-month group therapy unit in which social workers use games and guest speakers to stimulate group discussion and help the children cope with their emotions. Through Terra Firma, these immigrant children develop resilience, attain stability, and are strengthened for the fight before them.
Mr. Stark, one of the founders of Terra Firma, recently recalled an asylum case last year in which he sensed that his young client was holding back details of why he had fled Guatemala. Mr. Stark alerted the other founders of Terra Firma, Dr. Alan Shapiro, a pediatrician and the group's chief medical director, and Dr. Cristina Muniz, a pediatric psychologist. Over a period of several weeks of group therapy and individual sessions, the client eventually felt safe to tell of his horror. His best friend had been beheaded next to him by gang members. At the boys' asylum hearing, Dr. Muniz testified that it had taken 9 months for her patient to tell the story because he had suffered post-traumatic stress disorder. The judge granted the boy asylum. In 3 years, Dr. Shapiro had written affidavits for 26 clients who showed signs of trauma. All 26 cases, he said, resulted in approval to stay in the United States. We are trying, Dr. Shapiro shared, to give the kids the life that they deserve. But funding limits our staff's ability to serve all the children who need their assistance. The 200 clients we were able to assist represent a small drop in the bucket.
The importance of the work that these organizations do cannot be stressed enough. They provide people who seek a better life in the United States a fair chance. It's inspiring to have met the individuals who work in these nonprofit organizations. It gives us hope for a better tomorrow for not just these undocumented and unaccompanied minors in our country, but for all of us. After all, our nation is only as strong as its moral stance for peace, equity, and justice for all.
Terrific, thank you. Well, I certainly have questions, but before I chime in, I was wondering if students in Jordan have any questions, or Emily at the UN.
Should I start?
Yeah, go ahead, Kings.
Okay, so I just wanted to ask if legalizing undocumented immigrants in the United States would create a sort of incentive new undocumented immigration to the United States. So, for example, if the Mexicans and other Central Americans in the United States start having legal status with this, create bigger waves of immigration.
So would legalizing their status actually stimulate more immigrants? Anyone in New York want to tackle that question?
Sure. I mean, I feel like that's pretty hypothetical, but I would assume so, because, you know, the immigration process is already a huge risk for these undocumented immigrants, and if it were to be legalized, it would incentivize it for maybe we're not willing to make that sacrifice and come into this country. So yeah, I definitely think it would lead to more waves of immigration. Yeah.
Emily, you have any questions?
No, I'll let the students handle it.
All right, more questions from Jordan. Ibrahim?
No questions.
Okay. I had a question, if I might, and that would be, well, first of all, I'd point out that indeed, I think the statistics show that since the Trump administration has taken office, there's been a dramatic decline in the number of people trying to cross the border without a wall, by the way. So you could argue that simply the announcement of their policies has already had an impact. But I guess my question was, New York, what do you say to people who say that this is a problem that should be solved at the source, and that the United States economy and its society cannot accept any more of these individuals? What's your response to it?
Yeah, so the way I see it is that you have to understand like the severity of the situation in the countries people are fleeing from, and kind of these violent situations are based on a lot of different socio-political factors and also the history of these places. And so these places a lot of times don't have entirely the means to regulate themselves, and that could be from a lot of different things. And some of those situations in the U.S. is only responsible for. And I think as the U.S. kind of makes itself seem to be a country of immigrants and a country devoted to diversity. So I think a country that espouses that should very well have then the moral obligation to take in people that can truly only survive where they are. We can't act as if we are a moral country if we're going to let people go.
Can I also add something?
You got another comment?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Tyler is saying, like morally, but also just in terms of immigrants and just having people in this country who work jobs actually and like do contribute to our economy. So I think from that perspective as well, it wouldn't make sense to say that immigrants are hurting the American economy and taking away jobs, because that none of those claims are actually supported. These people actually have already started lives here, and some of the kids who were born in the U.S. or came here when they were really, really young, like kids who came here when they were extremely young and it wasn't under their control, like what they were talking about earlier, the dreamers, now they're under a threat to be deported to their countries when they came here very young and they're fully American. So there's that aspect of it too.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think economic data could dispute the notion that migrants are a drain on the U.S. economy, at least over time. With that, we'll have time for more questions later. Emily, can we turn to you then?
Great.
Over to you.
Can you start the presentation, Nelson?
Yeah, I could do so.
Okay, great.
Test my technical expertise here. Let's see if we can do this.
Okay.
Hold on, I'm just gonna, I have to go back to me. 1 second.
I'll just start. My name is Emily Krasner. I work at the UN Population Fund. It's a UN fund that our main activities are working on women and girls issues, gender-based violence, reproductive health programs for youth, both in development and in humanitarian settings. I personally work more in the humanitarian response realm of that. So I have worked in development or stable settings before, but my work now is mostly on humanitarian response.
Okay.
Next slide. Okay.
Hold on.
And I have a first grader at Friends.
Okay, now we have.
There we go. Thank you, Nelson.
You're welcome.
So we speak sometimes generally about forced displacement. There are now 65.3 million people worldwide who are forcibly displaced. That's roughly the population of France. And this is an increase from years previous. I think you all know the distinction between refugees and IDPs, but just to review, a refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. It is not someone seeking a job in another country. Sometimes there is sort of a hazy area if someone is seeking a job in another country because there is absolutely no opportunities left in their country. Is that person a refugee? And that can be sort of a little bit of a superficial distinction. But generally speaking, we define a refugee as someone who's fleeing due to persecution, war, or violence. 1.8 million internally displaced people. These are people who stay within their own country, but they're still on the run. And oftentimes they're on the run from something perpetrated by their own government, or there's a situation that their own government cannot control, and that is the reason for their displacement. But what do these people have in common? They're all just seeking safety. They feel like they're under threat, and that they can't live peacefully and they can't live safely. Currently, there are, I think, 56 countries with humanitarian needs. This was from 2017. It actually might be 2 more actually after the hurricane. So I think it's actually 58 right now. And we use the number 135 million people across the world who need humanitarian assistance. So those we actually also include and also serve those who might not be on the run, but who are sort of in their place and might have been lost their house, say due to a flood or an earthquake or whatever, but they're not necessarily have left their original sort of point of location. So who hosts refugees? I think the Friends group touched on this in terms of the North America context. Turkey was the biggest host country last year with 2.5 million refugees. And that's actually 1 refugee for every 5 citizens. I'm sorry, it's 1 refugee for every 5 citizens in Lebanon, which I think was the second biggest host country in 2017. In terms of IDPs, Colombia, almost 7 million, although a lot of those are starting to return. Syria at 6 million, and Iraq, especially northern Iraq, due to the Mosul response, 4.4 million. So what's new? What is new in, what are the new trends in humanitarian response, and what are the new trends in terms of forced displacement? For one thing, I think we've said that the scale of displacement that we're seeing right now is at a scale that we have not witnessed since the end of World War II. Another new characteristic is that people are living in protracted emergencies for much longer. I think 10 years ago, people were living in protracted emergencies an average of 7 or 8 years, and I think that's 16 to 17 years right now. So that really affects how I go about my work. Am I programming in some country for somebody who's going to be there for just a couple of years and they're going to return, or are they going to be in this place for 16 years? So that's a new reality that the humanitarian community is grappling with right now. Another difference is a younger and more female face of emergencies. Some statistics from about 10 years ago is largely older and largely male. So that's something else that we're dealing with right now. In 2005, requests for UN assistance in terms of financial requests was $7 billion, and it's $23 billion last year. So that's a big jump. So people are in crisis, living in crises longer. Obviously that costs more money, and 90% of humanitarian appeals last much longer, meaning the ask for funding, it gets renewed on a year basis, but it goes on much longer. Instead of 3 years, it usually goes on for 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And the last new difference, and this is especially true in terms of the Jordan context, is that people are not living in camps. Most refugees and IDPs are living in urban or semi-urban areas. I think in terms of the Syria refugees, I don't want to get this wrong, but I think it's almost 80% are living in urban areas and not in camps. While there still are camps in Jordan, I think most of them are in urban areas. So with this new context in mind, what does this give rise to? It gives rise to a number of challenges. In all humanitarian situations, we can generally say that families and communities are separated, that mechanisms for protection and service delivery, such as health, education, security, such as police, are disrupted, and community support systems break down, whether that's due to the disruption of family, or knowing that you can, walk down the street and have whatever service that you need. That's not there. And also your community networks are not there. So this is, these are things that are common to most humanitarian emergencies. And it is only predicted that conflict will remain a main driver for humanitarian needs and for displacement. Next slide, Nelson. Thanks. So where does that leave us? What's on this slide is basically the challenge that I deal with every day in my work. It's one challenge of many that are part of humanitarian response related to displacement, but this is the one that I deal with every day. 136 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. In crises, do women stop having babies? No, they do not. It's estimated that 1 in 5 women of childbearing age is likely to be pregnant. So how do you make sure that they have safe birth while they are on the move, while they are displaced, and when there are, sometimes very few, if no clinics set up? Many women lose access to family planning, obviously exposing them to unintended pregnancies. And women and young people become more vulnerable to gender-based violence. So the main challenge that drives my work is without access to reproductive health services, women face an increased risk of complications. Just as an aside, the world has made great strides in the last 20 years in terms of reducing maternal mortality, but still 60% of maternal deaths occur in crisis context. So that's something that we're working on. And then something else that is a great focus of my work is preventing and responding to gender-based violence in times of crisis, knowing that it tends to increase. So just a little bit of unsolicited career advice. This is the challenge that drives my work. And I think in terms of, deciding where you want to go in terms of your studies or your careers, I think it's always helpful to think about what challenge you want to solve and how you're going to solve it and how you're going to move around that challenge to find a solution for it. So, that's what drives my work. And this is my challenge on this page. Next slide. I'm not going to go, I think you have to just press another, sorry, I didn't mean to go in like that. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but this is just what we consider the 4 humanitarian principles that are necessary as an enabling environment for our work. Unlike, say, development assistance, where you're working directly with a government, sometimes with humanitarian assistance, you are working with governments, and sometimes they are not necessarily partners. Humanitarian assistance, we have these 4 principles so that we can establish and maintain access to the affected population and serve them to the best ability that we can. These cover not taking sides in a conflict, responding to the suffering that is found, and being motivated by where the greatest need is. And also just making sure that you're an autonomous actor, that you're not functioning with the government. You're not have economic or military objectives that might conflict with the humanitarian objective of promoting human dignity and protecting people affected by conflict. So won't spend too much time on that, but it's worth looking up if people are interested. Next. I want to say that obviously intrinsic to my work is gender and women and girls, but it's also something that all humanitarian actors need to keep in mind, and they all need to see crises through what we call a gender lens or a gender analysis. Why is this? It's basically because humanitarian situations are not gender blind. Conflict and natural disasters have different impacts on women, girls, men, and boys. And you need to figure out when you're responding to a disaster or you're responding to displacement, what are those differences? And what were the gender dynamics before the crisis, and how have they shifted during the crisis and after the crisis? And sometimes it shifts. Sometimes there are, openings in terms of promoting gender equality after a crisis, and sometimes negative gender norms might actually be further entrenched. But we need to have, as humanitarian actors, a really firm grasp on how humanitarian situations affect men, women, boys, and girls, and also more marginalized subgroups within that. Specifically, just to give you some examples, not that it's all about death numbers, but 90% of those killed in the 1991 cyclone in Bangladesh were women. And also there were some studies about increases in gender-based violence after Hurricane Andrew as well. And as I've said before, sexual violence does increase in times of humanitarian crisis, and that can come in many forms. It can be systematic, something carried out to destabilize a whole population and destroy community and family bonds. Or it could be more random and opportunistic, taking advantage of the lack of checks and balances, of the overall chaos of the situation. But either way, we assume that it's happening, and we assume that there's an increase, and we work with partners in other sectors, from water, sanitation, and hygiene, to camp management, to shelter provision, so that they can also put in preventive measures in their own sectors. Next slide. Sorry, I'm going fast, but as I said, there's a different impact and distinct needs of humanitarian crises on men, women, boys, and girls. And I think this slide is a good illustration of that. This is the tsunami, the Asian tsunami of, I think, 2005. And it basically says that 4 women died for every 1 male death. And basically this happened because actually a lot of men were out to sea, which was actually a protective factor. They were in fishing boats, and the way the wave or the tsunami came in, they were less harmed. And due to the social gender norms, women were confined to the home. There was an understanding that they should not leave the home, and that some of the women in this area were in restrictive clothing. And something that held true for a number of the tsunami-affected countries, where women were not taught how to swim. So even when the waters were not so high, they could not swim to safety. So knowing this, if you are, I'm just going to throw this out there, if you are a humanitarian response person programming for the UN in the tsunami-affected area within the year after, and knowing that there was this ratio in deaths, what do you think would happen, and how would you respond? Just, no ideas is bad, but just want to know how you might respond. Any ideas?
Emily's asking a question of our students. Feel free to answer. King's Academy or Friends Seminary?
Perhaps making sure that in other countries that have similar gender norms for women, where they also tend to wear restricted clothing, and their lives are largely domestic because of those norms. Maybe going there and starting programs there that could teach women other skills, or notifying or just educating women about these sort of facts.
What would you do with this affected population?
With this affected population?
Yeah,
I'd say educating them and
Sorry, we missed that.
maybe just educating them about these sort of statistics, so that the same thing doesn't happen again.
What happened there with the female deaths after the tsunami? It meant that men were now seeking younger wives, because there were not. I'm just hearing an echo. There were not enough women there who were in their age group, and that was a problem because when young women start having babies and getting married, they leave school, and they are more likely to have complications in childbirth. So that's something that communities or people working there, learn very fast, learn within the 2 years after the tsunami. And so what do you do in terms of, you can have campaigns against child marriage, because there was a spike in child marriage in some areas. You can support, another aspect was that widows and surviving women, their burden of care was greatly increased. So they were caring for children who did not have a mother. And so that was something that they needed support.
Can I interrupt
Yes.
here? Because we actually have 3 questions from our viewers, and if I could just ask, I'd like to get at least one of them out there. There's a question from Princeton Day School. I'm reading it. Do you think there's a way to discourage illegal immigration while also helping illegal immigrants who've already been assimilated into American society? So anyone could take a crack at that question. Would someone at Friends Seminary like to have a crack at that?
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah, it's from Princeton Day School. The question was, do you think there's a way to discourage illegal immigration while also helping illegal immigrants who've already been assimilated into American society?
Yeah. So that seems like a really interesting problem because it's hard to, like, on the one hand, help the people who have already been, who have already immigrated illegally, but it's also really important. So I think a lot of the legislation that's coming out, and the previously repealed legislation was doing a lot of work to support that. But it's hard to discourage illegal immigration and at the same time like promote assimilation because I don't like it sort of sends a conflicting message to do both at the same time.
I mean, I think another complication in all of that is how we are determining what immigrants are granted legal status. I mean, we're talking a lot about unaccompanied minors. The Dreamers obviously have been in America for all of their lives, essentially. So I think another question that I would just like add on to that is that you have to think about the question of like, yes, how do you, if you do think it is important to discourage illegal immigration, how do you do that? But at the same time, how do you determine what illegal immigration should be?
Okay, Emily is going to be leaving shortly. Did you have any? I'm afraid I cut your presentation off. Did you have any more closing comments, Emily?
No closing comments. If anybody has any other questions, I focus on humanitarian response with a focus on gender and gender-based violence. And if anybody has any additional questions, I'm happy to put my email in the chat and people can follow up with me.
Thank you very much. Okay, Emily, do you have King's Academy has a question for you. Do you have time just to take one question?
Yeah, happy to.
Okay.
So Europe, Okay.
Yeah.
Europe is arguably the #1 region where refugees are creating social issues in their communities. So how do you respond to people saying that Arab refugees, Muslim refugees are contributing to the Islamification of Europe?
Emily, did you hear that question?
I didn't hear the beginning. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Which continent are we talking
Maybe
about?
repeat the question and speak up just a tad. Thank you.
Okay, I'll repeat it. Okay. So Europe is arguably the #1 region where refugees are creating social issues in their communities because of cultural differences with their hosts. So how do you respond to people that say that Syrian and other Arab refugees are contributing to the Islamification of Europe?
Did you hear that, Emily?
Yeah. I mean, the UN does not, we don't have programs, in Central Europe, say Germany, France, where, some of these issues arise. I can speak to some other areas where we have programs for both refugees and for host communities. And in terms of creating a more enabling environment for, as I talked about, there's, sort of a sustained and prolonged displacement is, more often the norm now. So I know the UN and also the World Bank, we're focusing a lot on programs on integration. This is happening, or it was happening I think in Kenya. I think there's also some programs in Jordan. But so that benefit of the host community comes out more. And there's also some, has been some tension in some areas where they say, like, look at the refugees, they have these services that are in place, and I'm not sure if we all have these services. So they're establishing services that are really sort of contribute to the fabric of the whole community and not just to refugees as part of a camp setting, or more often than not in an urban setting. So I'm sorry to not answer your question about Europe, but that's really, not my area, because we don't do humanitarian response in Central Europe. But we do a lot towards integration of host communities and refugees through social services programming and what we call social cohesion programming in other places.
Great, Emily, thanks very much. We'll let you get on with your work day. I want to thank you for taking time out for this session today.
Thank you, everyone, and sorry for my rudeness to the two friends and Aman for not being able to learn from your presentation.
Well, let's turn. That's all right. Let's turn to Aman. Your chance now. Whatever order you choose.
Okay.
Be sure to speak up because your microphone's a little bit faint.
Okay. So I want to start by talking about Jordan history with hosting refugees. So
maybe could you give your name and where you're from, please?
Okay. My name is Layth Qassasiyya. I'm from Amman, Jordan. I'm originally Palestinian, and I'm a senior at King's Academy.
Right.
So Jordan's history with hosting refugees. So Jordan, since its independence, has been hosting millions and millions and millions of refugees. So currently, Jordan's population is 60% Palestinian, and we're talking about Jordanian citizens and not only people that reside here. So it all started in 1948 when Palestinian refugees came to Jordan. To the country that basically made Jordan's economy move, because Jordan wasn't, and it was mostly nomadic. The urban communities were very small, so it was sort of a huge increase in the population that was very quick. Then we move on to 1967, where there was the next day, which is another Palestinian-Israeli war, where millions of other Palestinians end up coming to Jordan and into other neighboring countries. And at this point, Jordan was a bit more established in terms of its economy. So there were different effects from 1948 when the refugees came in. So all these refugees were granted Jordanian citizenship upon their arrival to Jordan, and they live with full rights, like me, in the country. You get to vote, a lot of our prime ministers actually have been Palestinians. But in the 1970s, we had conflicts between these Palestinian refugees and Jordanians, and through the Palestinian liberation movements, many of our prime ministers and a lot of ministers were actually assassinated, and there was a lot of conflict and violence between these two groups. This ended up being solved at the end, and throughout the years, we started receiving even more refugees from different countries. So I believe the next wave of refugees that came to Jordan was actually from Iraq, through the multiple Iraq wars, and also a lot of returning Jordanians from the Gulf War, from countries like Kuwait, which also created different issues in Jordan. So specifically the Gulf War, this has created a lot of social issues in Jordan, since the Jordanian population changed in a way since cultures from the Gulf came into the country. So even though we are all Arab, there's a lot of difference in the way we think, how conservative our society is, and that was a big difference. And currently, the biggest issue that we have today in Jordan is the Syrian refugee crisis, which is bringing in millions of refugees. So none of the Iraqis and Syrian refugees have been granted citizenship, and the Syrians, mainly, a lot of them live in refugee camps, but they're predominantly urban refugees.
Thank you. Ibrahim, could you just say who you are and where you're from?
My name is Ibrahim Al-Abusi. I'm originally from Iraq, and this is my first year at King's Academy. The experience of Syrian refugees once they arrive in early 2000, in late 2011, the influx of Syrian refugees at the time in Jordan was moderate. Thus, it was accepted by the Jordanian government. But later in early 2013, the influx was so high that the Jordanian government was forced to sort of regulate the entrance of Syrian refugees into Jordan, and it started to create the camps known as Zatari and Azraq. And as they said, the majority of and also Emily, she also said that the majority of Syrian refugees in Amman or in Jordan in general are urban refugees in cities such as Amman and Irbid, and rather than in the camps. And the reason behind that, we think, is because the environment in the camp does not, there aren't a wide spectrum of opportunities and jobs to be held in the camp. And going into the city offers a lot more opportunities, and this is why a lot of Syrian refugees prefer to stay in the city rather than the camp. The only way for a Syrian refugee to leave the camp is to have a Jordanian let's say, agent that would be able to take responsibility for them. Other than that, they can also be held responsible by relatives who are also Syrian who live in the city can also take responsibility for their relatives or friends in the camp, and this sort of increased the number of Syrians in the city.
So I'll now talk about the governmental response from the Jordanian government. So in February 2016, the Jordanian government made a deal with the EU, which basically stated that we would receive $1.7 billion in funds for development if Jordan opens the labor market to Syrian refugees. And once 200,000 labor permits are issued, we will also have free trade with the EU. There's another issue with the Syrian refugee crisis currently, which is basically there are around 60,000 Syrian refugees currently that are stuck on the border of Jordan and Syria. So the issue with these refugees is basically that these refugees come from areas that are affected by ISIS, and they're heavily suspected of being part of that terrorist group. And there are also a lot of responses from these refugees that basically attacked Jordanian forces, killing about more than 10 Jordanian soldiers. And this has created an outcry in the international community and in Jordan. Jordan is refusing to accept these refugees, rightfully so, into the country. But lots of international organizations like Amnesty and a lot of international bodies are pushing Jordan to host these refugees. So I'm also going to move on now to basically the main groups of refugees in Jordan. So you have the Syrians, Palestinians, Iraqis, and you also have the Egyptians, which aren't really refugees, but rather economic migrants. So Jordan also has an issue of illegal migration, like the United States. We have hundreds of thousands of illegal Egyptian workers that work in the country without proper permits, that basically come in with permits and then they expire and then they stay here. This is also an issue because this affects our relationship with Egypt. If we deport around 700,000 people from Jordan, we were basically creating an economic crisis in Egypt, and this comes as a diplomatic limbo when Egypt is in such a bad economic and social state.
Yeah. As for the way Jordan responds, the Jordanian government's response to, as they said, the economic migration that's happening, It's important to note that the refugees who come from Syria or Iraq, they are, of course, they need to have a source of income in order to have a stable livelihood in Jordan. So they start working, but however, the government's point of view on employment is different for each category of refugees. For example, Iraqis are not allowed to work unless they have a certain document that proves that they have the financial ability to actually make capital investments in Jordan. Um, and as for Syrian refugees, it's uh, they are allowed to apply for a permit. However, the array of jobs they are allowed to undertake is limited. For example, they cannot be engineers, they cannot be doctors, and other such careers that might be that are sort of uh, high that have high wages. Mainly the Syrian work spectrum focuses mainly on in agriculture and crafts maybe, and this has definitely taken its toll on agriculture of Jordan and the growth from that aspect.
Can I just interrupt here because we're running out of time, and I'm pretty sure that we're going to have questions from Friends Seminary in New York. I don't want to cut you short, but I also don't want to deprive them of an opportunity to ask a question. Friends Seminary, do you guys have any questions of the gentleman in Jordan?
Hi. I was just wondering if you guys could speak to the. Sorry, I was just wondering if you guys could speak to the experience of minors or children coming into the same situation, and if there are any exceptions or allowances made for immigrants entering who are below the legal age.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a very good question. I believe that if young people are treated differently than adults, or no, young people are treated differently than families. Their entrance to Jordan, I would say, is more hindered when it comes to being a bachelor. But I think the humanitarian response for youth is quite good. For example, I think in 2012, when I was in Jordan, I was also an urban refugee, and the because I was out of school, and this really affected how it was like. It was very sedentary, let's say. I didn't have a lot of things to do, and it was impacting my brain a lot. But there were some NGOs around in the area, and their response was by offering to programs in order to motivate the youth and give them something to do in their free time, especially since a lot of refugee children do not go to school because they either have to work or they simply do not have the financial ability in order to go to school, and or sometimes tradition might come into play when it comes to education, especially for girls.
Yeah,
Ibrahim,
that's definitely the case. Yeah, please.
You've missed several years of school, you said, Ibrahim. Could you just say a word on your own background? How did you, where did you come from in Iraq, and how did you end up in Jordan?
Sure. I left Iraq in 2007 after my father was kidnapped, and he then escaped, and we had to leave Iraq. We had no other choice. We went to Syria afterwards, actually, and we stayed in Syria for about 5 years.
Which part of Syria? Was it Damascus or elsewhere?
In Damascus, yes. Yeah, and in early 2011, we came here to Jordan because my father anticipated that something was going to happen in Syria, so he said that it would be better to leave as quickly as possible. As I came here, I missed 1 year of school. That I went to school for 2 years, and then I dropped out for another three years. During that time, I was a lot of stuff were happening for me. I was emotionally and physically sort of let's say, I don't know, immobile. I had nothing to do, and I would say that the humanitarian response for the youth was incredibly helpful in getting me back on my feet and giving me interests and goals that I still aspire to. So in Syria, these kind of opportunities were not offered, or at least, to my knowledge, they weren't. But in Jordan, this sort of form of humanitarian aid was hugely accentuated by the recurrent sort of influx of refugees.
We have time for one. Any questions from Friends Seminary in New York? Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering what the kind of Jordanian government's response is, well, not response, maybe justification for a certain kind of discriminatory policing on the jobs of refugees, like you talked about, the occupational discrimination. Like, what basis is that founded on?
So based on the supply and job markets in Jordan. So, for example, in Jordan, doctors and engineers are generally we have a general surplus of these professions, since it's very popular in our culture and tradition. So a lot of Jordanians end up in universities as engineers, and a lot of them end up being unemployed when they graduate. And basically, what the Jordanian government is basically doing is that they want to protect the jobs that the Jordanians already have, because generally Syrians come with a different mindset and work ethic that Jordanians don't necessarily have, and a lot of people prefer to hire them. So this would create a huge issue with basically the job market and for Jordanians. And basically, the Jordanian government wants to avoid any rebellion from the Jordanian people, and they want to basically make them happy. So of course, that is a big factor that plays into this job discrimination.
Right. I'd like to ask one last question. This one comes in from one of our viewers, and this would be for Friends Seminary. The question is, how can students partake in sustainable action to support immigrant peers in the United States? Anyone at Friends Seminary like to tackle that one? Yes.
Okay. We'll split it because you guys had a lot more experience than I did. But one thing that I wanted to say is that there are a lot of different programs in New York that support a lot of different groups of individuals who, for whatever reason, have more difficulty than others, and that includes immigrants in a lot of cases. So I work with Go Project, and a lot of the students there are first-generation immigrant children, and they're having difficulties in school, largely linguistic difficulties because English isn't a first language. And so that's a really good way, I think, to work with immigrants and learn a little bit more about their experience, especially as young kids. But I know Daphne and Elliot know a lot more than I do, so.
Excellent. And with that, we're going to have to cut this one short. I'm absolutely sure that there are more questions that you would ask of one another, so I'm going to make sure to exchange your emails with one another so you can follow up offline. But with that, we need to wrap up the last webinar of 2017. I'd like to thank today's participants and the viewers. I can't think of a more important topic for students at News Decoder's partner institutions to examine. It's very much a tough problem, and one, unfortunately, that's not going to go away very soon. Looking ahead to 2018, we will have webinars on women's rights, human trafficking, and secessionist movements in Europe, as well as a look at the issues at the U.S. southern border with Mexico. So I want to wish you all a very restful and very peaceful end of the year, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon in 2018. Thanks very much.